Yeah, so we also have to learn to be more efficient. For example, in irrigation, when we use water to grow food, it takes one of these, 1 liter of water, to make just 1 food calorie. So in this room, we probably on average eat about 3,000 calories a day. That means we carry around 3,000 of these. I need to grab a few more. And we carry them with us in our food every day because of the way irrigation is so efficient. But if we think of other parts of the world, they might use 10 times that much. Oops, I lost one.
He's on a diet.
Yeah, it's a little lighter now, that load. So we see that we can be much more efficient in, like Israel is very efficient with water, but in India, for example, it's quite inefficient with water. So we can see very big differences in water use, chemical use, land use, and so on. And there are opportunities to be at least 10 times more efficient than we are today in our use of water and material. Finally, this is the one that gets a lot of people in America very nervous because of the way we live our lives. But we really have to think not only about the supply of food, but also what we do with the food we already have. And that thinks about diets and biofuels and also how we waste food in lots of different places. And I just want to show this one picture to everyone. This is a map of what we do with the crops we grow, the food we grow in the world. The green places in the world, like India, China, most of Africa, the Mediterranean regions, most of Mexico, those are places where almost all of the food that is grown is fed directly to people. So wheat and rice and cassava, things like that. But the red places, Western Europe, but especially the United States, we don't feed people, we feed cars and cows and animals instead. And that's actually very inefficient use of our food. So if we made all of the red places more green, we'd have a lot more food available with what we already have. So vegetarian diets, maybe changing biofuels policies, those kinds of things. And it turns out that's an enormous amount of food because 40% of the food we grow isn't actually food. 60% is fed to people, 30 to 35% are fed to animals, and about 5 to 10% to biofuels. On top of this use of food, there's also a lot of food that's wasted. In poor countries, it may be because the farmer grew the crop, but it never got to the market because there's no transport or storage along the way. But in rich countries like the United States and Western Europe, for example, we waste a lot of food in our cafeterias, our restaurants, and our homes because it's kind of a luxury. We have a lot of good food in our trash that we never get to eat. So if we take both of those, we could feed the world quite a long way by just changing the food we already have, thinking about being more efficient and more mindful of it. Good. So the good news here is it is possible to address this big challenge of feeding the world and making it sustainable. It is entirely possible to do that. The bad news is it is not assured at all. We have to do a lot of things together and work very, very hard for this to get happening. So I would argue we have the tools to do this, but we maybe don't have the will or the compassion or the ethical framework which will encourage us to do this, which I hope to learn from you how we can do that. But I think we need to get together very soon and learn how to do this and get to work on this very big challenge. Thank you.
So the argument that you are making that if we are more efficient and based on the current land use,
present population.
So this is based upon the 7 billion number.
Right.
So how about 9 billion that you were talking about? Can we still
9 billion then?
Yeah, exactly. If we, with going from 7 billion to 9 billion, we're adding 2 billion people, and the 4 billion people now in the world who are getting much richer, together that means we'll have to grow twice as much food by 2050. About a third of that increase is from the population. 2/3 is from people becoming richer and eating more meat and other kinds of diets. So the solutions we outline can do that. It would double the amount of food in the world, taking care of the other 2 billion people and the economic growth of people already here, and solve these environmental problems. The problem is we're going almost exactly in the opposite direction. We're wasting more and more food. We're turning more and more of our food into animals and into biofuels. And in our country and in many other places, we seem to think the solution to this is to grow more crops with things like GMOs, these genetically modified crops, or very intense kind of industry, being how we do agriculture, industrial agriculture. I don't think that's really the way to do it. There may be other ways, including things we learned from industry, but also from the organic farming world and from what we call agroecology. And I think, like you said very wisely this morning, there's no black and white answer. It's not all one or all the other, but some harmony of the two, learning from this, the good from this side and the very good from this side, could come together and solve this problem. But we seem to be at an impasse right now on how to do that effectively. So the problem isn't science or technology. It's really in the realm of how do we motivate change to do what we need to do.
May I ask one question?
Of course. Yes.
I think the 80s, I think, one occasion in England, some scientists, I had some sort of conversation. They say then around population around 6 billion. So then they say, this moment there's huge gap rich and poor. Southerner poor, northerner rich. So the Southerners' living standard have to raise up to living standard of Northerners enjoying. So in that, this present sort of population, around 6 billion, their sort of living standard raise equal level, then already questionable nature resources are sufficient or not.
Right.
So now, when you say, even 9 billion, if we utilize properly all available land, these things, and still can fit, can feed.
Feed now.
So of course, living standard raise not only just food, but also their lifestyle. And the big differences you have
So from your point of view, I mean, taking into account what His Holiness heard in 1980s.
Yeah.
So from your point of view, even if, say, for example, people from the poorer regions from the south, their living standard is raised up, would you still maintain that we can still sustain?
That's good news. Very good news.
See, he's Dr. Doom. I'm Dr. Happy. It's possible. So this is the tempered version of that. It is possible, just barely, that we could meet the needs of 9 billion people with better diets than we see globally today. But a lot of that is that people, like myself and like a lot of people in this room, may have to change our diets, not downward in terms of quality. We could eat better, but maybe eat less.
That's right.
We
See,
converge
some
in
of
the middle.
these sort of developed countries, their lifestyle, you see, they have to sort of carry with sort of conscience of the rest of the poorer section of the people. So less expensive lifestyle.
Less luxurious.
Less luxuries.
Yeah.
Then perhaps I think practical. We Buddhist monk, no dinner. So I think many of you, one way, very much concerned about your overweight, but at the same time, eating a lot. That's also contradiction. Yeah. So I think follow some other sort of practice. Heavy breakfast, and heavy lunch,
Yeah.
very light or no dinner. Perhaps I think that's
Yeah.
good method.
Is that your secret?
We do that.
You're very
I
thin.
think you know,
Yeah.
the Sri Lankan people.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
the Buddhist community.
Yes.
Yeah.
No dinner.
Yes.
Like that.
Well, so it's another good reason we should all become monks and nuns.
No. The Muslims, they're fasting also, you see.
Oh, yeah.
So that kind of the practice.
Yeah.
Less food. And mainly concerned about even not thinking it's the global sort of issue, but simply your own. Many times, many years ago, in Harvard here, I give some sort of lecture in Harvard University. Right? So my driver, very fat, very overweight. But while he's driving, he always something eating.
Yeah.
That's too much, I think.
Yeah.
So the overweight, his own creation, like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's good.
So, John, on that, one of the things that you mentioned several times was this notion of eating less meat, or this notion that as people get richer, they tend to eat meat. Do you have any further thoughts on that in terms of how we might be able to either cap that, or why that happens as a social function? Why do people start eating meat when they get richer? Is that always been programmed from our hunter-gatherer days?
I wish I knew. I'm sure there are anthropologists and others who've thought about this, but it's a really clear kind of data signal. If you look at meat consumption versus income, everybody follows the same line. And you might say, oh, but China and India won't do that. China and India are doing that, in fact, even in India. So it's astonishing. They see people doing this, breaking with traditions to join kind of a Western, kind of status. But where I think the leverage point might be isn't like eating meat altogether. Maybe, I don't think we're going to become all vegetarians. But there's a lot of difference between feeding grain to cattle versus grass-fed cattle, for example, or eating chicken, or maybe dairy or other things. There's about a factor of 10 more resources needed to make and make beef than chicken in the United States. A lot of people here probably don't realize grain-fed meat in the United States, where we take corn and soybeans from the Midwest and feed it to cattle, it takes about 33 kilograms of grain to make 1 kilogram of beef. 33 to 1. That's crazy. Yeah, that's really crazy. But for dairy, it's like 2 to 1. Or for chicken, it's maybe 10 to 1, which is still bad, but a lot better than 33 to 1. So there are lots of things we can do there, and that doesn't even count grass-fed beef and other things. So I'm not a vegetarian. I'm married. I have to negotiate these things at home, like a lot of people. But
you're going to start skipping dinner now.
Apparently. That's a good idea. I probably should. But at home, I actually like to eat meat when we can think about, well, where was this sourced from? Can I encourage meat production in systems that are maybe better for the environment by a factor of 2 than what we might buy at a regular grocery store? And I think a lot of people are doing this, but again, I personally don't like black and white solutions of, everyone must become a vegan to solve this problem. I don't think that's realistic, but can we meet somewhere in the middle between, Big Mac and Big Vegan? Somewhere like that.
James, you're a doctor, a medical doctor. Do you think that the argument might work better coming at people from a health perspective as opposed to an environmental or ethical perspective? Do you think that might be an angle?
I do. And in fact, I will talk about that. I think as well, though, that there are scientific findings that are extremely important in terms of how we approach the framing of a message, whether it's from a agricultural perspective, from a climatology perspective, or from a health perspective. And there's a very prominent and significant thinker, George Lakoff, who has talked and researched seriously this issue. And he has discovered through brain science and cognitive science and neuroimaging that in fact we don't reason We don't make decisions based on what he calls enlightened reasoning, which is not the enlightenment that His Holiness speaks about. But enlightened reasoning, in his description, is reasoning that is based on logic, is calculated, is conscious, and is unemotional. And in fact, his research shows very clearly that as human beings, we make decisions based on what he calls real reason, which is variable, is unconscious, is emotional, and can be identified through appropriate brain imaging. And I think this is extremely important in terms of our understanding of how to frame an issue, how to communicate an issue. And I'm
going to have... So, thank you. And you're up, I think, next, is it?
Great.
Is it? Yes. Thanks, John. Really appreciate it. So next up is Dr. James Orbinski, and he's speaking on humanitarian action and global health, what was termed the dark side. So I'm eager to hear what this is about.
well, let me see if I can get my slides as a beginning.
No. You know what you did in the morning. Why were you doing tech support today?
Okay. There we go. Well, if you're Dr. Doom and you're Dr. Happy, I think I'm Dr. Reality. Charlie Brown is a very famous philosopher who uses humor to speak the truth. He said at one point in his illustrious career that I love humanity. It's just the people that I find difficult. Now, humor can reveal the truth, and it is easy to love an idea, but it is far more difficult to love reality. Humanity is not simply an idea, but it is a reality. And the reality is that we are not simply one world. We, in fact, live in a world that is deeply divided. Ours is a tale of two worlds. Life expectancy in North America today is 80 years. Life expectancy in South Africa today is 40 years and falling, while life expectancy in North America is 80 years and increasing. This is a man who was dying of HIV/AIDS. And this man is an example of the some 33 million people today who live with HIV, the vast majority of whom are in the developing world, 95% of whom are in the developing world. This is the same man, 6 months later, after he had access to the treatment for AIDS or antiretroviral therapy. The vast majority of people who have HIV do not have access to treatment. That is one example of the gross and egregious inequity that in fact defines our world. When I say I'm Dr. Reality, I want to make clear one very important distinction. There is a distinction between humanitarianism and global health. They are different. Humanitarianism is a necessary but not sufficient condition for achieving global health. In my view, humanitarianism is rooted in a very simple idea. It is seeing the sameness of self in the other, or seeing the dignity of the other, and acting for the immediate relief of human suffering. But this has enormous implications for individual behavior, for social behavior, for political construction and function, and also in a 21st century world for governance. Global health, on the other hand, in its broadest conception, connotes a well-being in a state of justice. Now, this is an inherently political definition. And if global health is to be something other than an ideal that's perpetually beyond our grasp, it requires a framework rooted in fact, in reality, in history, in an understanding of contemporary reality, and in a morality. Now, global health in the last 15 years has undergone an enormously significant revolution. Never before in the history of the world have we politically, socially, and in every possible human way paid as much attention to health as we have in the last 15 years. The achievements have been enormous. There are a range of actors, from states to intergovernmental organizations, to foundations, to non-government organizations. There has been an enormous increase in money that has been spent in the last 15 years. In 1990, $5 billion a year was spent on global health. Today, it's $21 billion. There have been new institutions created, for example, the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria. There have been new mandates for intergovernmental organizations. The Bretton Woods institutions have taken on global health as a major issue, and the UN, in fact, has taken on global health as a human security issue. We've never seen such policy convergence as we have seen in the last 15 years, and this is a cause for hope. This is cause for a world of possibility. And yet, as has been pointed out at various points throughout the day, we are 7 billion people. We're adding 1 billion every 13 years. 1 billion people go to bed hungry every single night. The inequity in terms of disposable income is egregious. Of our 7.2 billion, more than half, 3.8 billion, live on less than $2 a day. Poverty and the inequity in poverty leads to decreased adaptability and decreased resilience of individuals, of families, and of communities. The richer in our world today are getting richer, and the poorer in our world today are getting poorer. These factors, coupled with climate change, with the environmental degradation, with unsustainable development, lead to increased vulnerability and lead to a major and morally unacceptable set of outcomes. We've talked a great deal today about global warming. This slide indicates or shows very clearly the reality of global warming. There's been a 40% reduction in Arctic sea ice in the last 33 years. We are, as has been described properly and thoroughly over the day, we are in a new age, the Anthropocene. This new age means, in the context of the inequity that I've described, it means that disparities between rich and poor nations and between privileged elites and marginalized populations within each country are actually expected to worsen with the negative effects of climate change. And this will disproportionately impact low and middle income countries. And most specifically, this is already impacting Southeast Asia, South America, and most significantly, Sub-Saharan Africa. The issues that are already at play are myriad, but they are water security, they are war over access to resources, they are emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases such as malaria and tuberculosis, and they are mass migration. At this point, some of the most conservative estimates suggest that we could see upwards of 700 million climate migrants by 2030. Drought, of course, is today a real and growing problem in Africa. By 2030, some estimates suggest that crop yields could fall by 50% across the continent of Africa. And other estimates suggest that crop yields in South America and in some parts of Southeast Asia could fall by 20 to 50% by 2030. There are other factors that are less well known in the public domain in terms of the effects of climate change on global health. One is air quality. Air quality affects radically cardiovascular status and disease, increasing stroke, respiratory disease, asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and so on. The effect of pollution and heat stress is profound. Obviously, extreme weather events, food insecurity, which John has talked about at length. The nutrition deficits associated with food insecurity are profound, and they're not simply momentary, they're lifelong. The developmental effects of sustained deprivation of food last a lifetime, affect an individual for a lifetime, and affect a society for a lifetime. The other major variable, of course, is social unrest and the mental health effects associated with climate change. So reducing injustice and enhancing global health is very much a matter of practical action. It requires careful thinking, it requires initiative, and a willingness to experiment with new approaches. And most importantly, it requires that we think ethically and then act ethically in our pursuit of global health. So, is there a different way of doing things? Well, I think there are three key issues from a scientific perspective, a bench science perspective, and also from a political or social science, and more specifically political science perspective, that are extremely important. I've already talked a little bit about framing and the difference between enlightened reason versus real reason. This is extremely important in terms of understanding communication and in terms of using the power of communication to mobilize communities to engage in experimentation around problem solving. The other is that within the context of framing, emphasizing healthy human communities and the possibility of actually achieving good outcomes, this is a positive message, and one that actually inspires and enables and allows individuals and communities to build for a world of possibility as opposed to a world of doom. The other key issue in terms of framing is the use of active problem solving to foster individual and community resilience and positive mitigation and adaptation strategies. I won't go into the details, sorry? On time here. Okay. I won't go into details on modeling, but modeling the effects of climate change on global health has not really been properly and thoroughly engaged, and this is a serious scientific enterprise that needs to be undertaken. Governance is critical. How we approach the complexity of these issues is absolutely critical. And here, developing an equity-based global public health perspective is, in my mind, front and center. Governance is a complex process. It's not well understood. It's different from government, but it involves strategies and approaches to dealing with the complexity of actors that now are part of the international political order. And let me close by making an important distinction between hope and optimism. And this distinction is not mine, it's Václav Havel's, who many of you will be familiar with. I am very hopeful. Hope is the certainty that a given action is right, that it makes sense, regardless of how the situation might turn out for you. I believe that if we act hopefully, then we actually create the conditions for optimism. And optimism is the expectation, based on the evidence at hand, that there is, in fact, a reasonable chance of a good outcome. Thank you.
James, maybe I can throw one question at you to start. You started us off on this path that gave us the impression that in the 15 years in the past, we have made big progress in global health, and people's lives were getting better. And then you rocked our world by showing us, you know, what climate change and loss of resources could do to it. But let me ask you, if you took climate change and resource use, diminishing resources, off the table, do you think the will and the ability is there for us to continue those strides? I mean, in other words, is it the fact that there is now this pressure of climate and diminishing resources that is really threatening to derail this train, or was the train already on the wrong track?
Well, there are a myriad of changes in the world today that I didn't describe. So, for example, we are now in a multipolar world. The United States is not the hyperpower as it was, as it self-described at the beginning of the 21st century. It is the dominant power, and it will remain dominant. But the degree of dominance is significantly diminished in the face of the rise of the BRICS, and most especially China, in terms of their economic, political, and military power. The power shift from the G8, which was really the epicenter of functional military and economic power in the first post-Cold War decade, that power has shifted to the G20. And the single most important space for international political discourse and exercise of power, in fact, is now the G20. And the United States is part of that. So we are in a vastly different world. And in that context, with economic and political contestations, if you will, in the pursuit of power, issues like global health become marginalized. And it's quite separate from the driver of climate change and resource depletion. I actually look at climate change and resource depletion as an opportunity, because to prioritize global health, and I look at the reframing of this issue of climate change in terms of health as an opportunity created, in fact, by the risks that climate change pose. And the reason for that is that climate change is a shared risk. It's a problem of the global commons. Only a global solution can effectively deal with that problem. And so by looking at the problem in a slightly different way and breaking it down into its core elements and looking at the changed global context, I think it is possible to reframe and to prioritize and maintain, if you will, health as a kind of a normative frame that can help us achieve real positive outcomes in terms of dealing with climate change.
Mm-hmm. If I might ask Your Holiness, when you have the opportunity to travel around the world and meet people from all walks of life, it seems that health is one of those basic needs that is on everyone's mind. Are you seeing the sense of optimism, or at least of hope, in terms of people feeling like their lives are getting better? And is the dialogue improving in that bigger context?
Of course, I had a number of occasions visit different countries, but not all. And then also, there not much opportunity to learn, to hear, hearing from their sort of problems and so on, their sort of, including health. So I don't know. But I just felt, you mentioned their life
life expectancy.
Oh, in America is increasing. Africa decreasing. What's the main cause? Of course, the nature sort of the drought and the starvation, all these things also there, and politically also is a lot of sort of turmoil,
unstable.
Of course, there are many
factors,
but what is the main cause?
So the main cause,
the main cause of increasing life expectancy,
of decreasing life expectancy in the developing world.
Oh,
What you've identified Your Holiness, are the proximate causes, so drought, infectious disease, and so on. Those are the immediate proximate causes. But the World Health Organization released a report 3 years ago that looked at what it calls the societal determinants of health. And the societal determinants of health are the daily circumstances that people live and work in, and the structural elements of society. So access to education, access to employment, access to public services, the provision of sewage, sanitation, and so on. These are the core structural elements that within which individuals live their lives. If the societal determinants of health can be addressed, then we will see major improvements in those proximate causes of disease and suffering. The other thing that I think it's important to note is that in the context of prior discussions around population, one of the single most powerful facts of social science is that as education increases, population decreases. And most specifically, within one generation, if you target women, if young girls and women achieve education and higher levels of education, there's a direct correlation with higher achievement in education and decreased population. So this is the most effective form of birth control. It's not technologically dependent. It's embedded in society, and it fundamentally transforms society. And the other thing that I think is quite important to at least pose to you, Your Holiness, is the question of values. I spend a lot of time looking at scenarios, and many security establishments here in the United States or in the UK or Europe or Canada have done scenario analyses of the future and have mapped out different potential futures. And there's a good theory base to scenario mapping. And one of the key things that's recognized is that one of the core drivers of any scenario is culture and values. And one of the things that's also recognized is that the most malleable, the most changeable driver is, in fact, culture and values. And shifts in culture and values can occur abruptly, very quickly, and can fundamentally change the evolution of a particular scenario. So the emphasis, your emphasis on secular ethics and your emphasis on values through this center and through other initiatives, I think is extremely important. And I think it's also extremely important to be rigorous about the methodology and the science of that process. And I think that in fact is one of the most powerful things that we could explore.
Would you like to respond to that? I mean, the proposition is that values and culture obviously play a big role, but that it can shift very quickly. And I'm wondering whether you might want to respond to that as a factor to help global health.
Value and culture, these things I think mainly related with mind. So that feeling on physical level and mental level, I think urgent things are physical level. So because of the food and all these are the, I think, first sort of step. I noticed this is the people who materially sort of quite okay. Then, you see, they understand these deeper values. Then people, their daily life, desperate. Then these values, no direct sort of link. They will not see direct link. So basically, their living standard should also improve. Then, as you mentioned, education, all these values not come from impose or something by force. But these things voluntarily. In order to come from voluntarily, they must see their benefit. So again, education, very important. Now this morning and afternoon also, a lot of sort of problems. Listen, too much problem, then a little bit frustrated.
Discouraged.
Discouraged.
Well, please don't say that.
But I really appreciate such sort of experts, you see, one particular field, really study.
Very deeply now.
Very deeply. And also you're suggesting how can overcome these things. This is really wonderful. Really wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Individual. Thank you.